offered me a work position doing translation work for them. But no. Hey, Sarah and Maya. All right, you're important people here, so I'm gonna pipe down.
No, it was great. It was great talking with you.
You too, Madeline.
Hello.
Maya, you're on mute.
Maya, there should be a button on the bottom left.
Yes. Okay. I got it. Yeah. Somehow I got myself. I was sitting in like my personal Zoom room by myself. I was like, "Where is everyone?" Sorry about that.
Okay.
Hey, fun. Hi, Angela. How are you?
I'm officially back this week.
Okay. Good.
Slowly getting into things like reading stuff for tomorrow and for later this week, and don't know which section I'm teaching yet.
Oh,
but
okay.
Learning about Canvas. Yeah, I mean, I let Lacey know I'm like, look, I'm really flexible, but now I might be regretting that. But anyway, but I am looking like I'm going to be doing a lot of course prep. I've been doing a lot of the Canvas workshops. And
okay.
I'm just be doing a ton of crapola.
Oh, you're doing Canvas.
I have not. Okay, so yesterday I started attending workshops. Before that, I hadn't even opened it. I like it so far.
You too?
Being there, why? Yeah. I just didn't know enough about Blackboard, but I mean, seeing some of the ways, like if a student has an accommodation, the way I could just set that up.
Oh, that's nice.
You know, okay, this person gets quiz time plus 10 minutes. Not that I do that much, but that's possibly. This person gets a different due date than the others because I've given them an extension. And then I have to go check anywhere and see. That's kind of small. The ideas of the modules and copying over the modules, I am going to have to rethink some of the course organization to make it clearer, the way to be able to direct student flow. Yeah, I like it so far.
Okay.
Have you used it before? And
I used it at Marymount. How about you guys? But I didn't like it. They put it in the semester that I was leaving, so I never really kind of like adjusted. And I can see that it could be a little bit easier or cleaner, but I spent, I'm used to Blackboard at this point. Have you guys used it, Madeline and Maya?
I didn't have the bandwidth to do it this whole thing. Okay,
yeah.
So but yeah, so I haven't tried it yet, but
I have not personally. Can I just quickly ask my presenters, are we planning to do any breakout rooms?
I don't think so. Yeah, because it's really small. So, and I don't know where Cynthia is, but she's probably on her way, I guess. Yeah, so I don't think we're going to do breakout rooms.
Okay, great. And do you have any slides that you're planning to project?
Yeah, I think all three of us have something we're going to share.
Okay. Do you need any help with the screen share or anything?
I think we're good. Sarah, you're good with that, right?
Yeah. Are we all co-hosts?
Let me make sure you all are.
Yeah, that's a good question. I looked and I couldn't tell before.
Sarah, you are not, but I will do that right now.
Okay.
And Madeline, are you doing like the letting people in? Is that?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Perfect. Okay.
I have that under control.
Lovely. I see that popping up and I just wasn't sure. Thank you.
Yes.
Maya, do you want me to go and send the link to, I'm already forgetting her name, to the other?
Oh, Cynthia? Yeah.
Yeah. I can, let me just.
Yeah, do you mind? Yeah, thank you.
I don't mind. I'll just be going for a sec. Hold on.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Oh, so Madeline, did you see Cynthia Miller-Idris, who I think you just admitted her? If you could make her a co-host as well.
Yes.
Thank you. I wasn't sure how that all worked. Thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Thanks, Sarah. She's here, so.
Okay, I heard.
Sorry about that. I had some trouble logging on, but I'm here now.
No, lovely. Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Here, okay. And yes, let's make sure, Cynthia, you are co-host. Yes, good, okay. Okay, so I guess cool to get started. Does that work for everyone here? Sorry, I've not done one of these yet. So, okay, let me just. Okay, so lovely. It's nice to see everyone here today. I will just share my screen and get going. There we go. Okay. Oh, sorry. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to make this go up. How do you make this part? Okay, sorry.
Are you looking for?
Sorry. Yeah, I'm trying to do the slideshow, but then that little black box. Sorry, I've not done one of these yet. The little black box is in my way, so I'm just trying to push it up. Does anyone know how to do that? Wait, okay, that's pause.
There should be a presentation button on the bottom.
Oh, on the bottom right. Okay.
Yes. Next to the minus.
There we go. Okay, this is fun. All right, thank you for your patience. Okay, good. Well, thank you and welcome everyone. My name is Maya Brown, and I teach in the Writing Studies department in literature, and I'm also the chair of the Writer's Witness Committee. So we are obviously here to talk about the Writer's Witness book for this year. So I just wanted to give you a brief sort of outline of what we're going to do, a little bit, just a tiny bit about the program and the book, and then we'll move on to the panelists and then the Q&A and discussion. So today we have speaking Cynthia Miller-Idris, who is a professor of education and sociology in the School of Education. She also wears lots of other hats. Sarah Trembeth in the literature department with me in writing studies, and then me, of course. So Cynthia is going to talk to us a little bit about sort of the bigger picture things, a little bit of the background in the issues that are embedded in the book, and then address some common questions around some of these bigger issues. Sarah's going to talk to us about information literacy and civil discourse, and then I'm going to briefly talk about language and rhetoric in the book and how that applies to some of the bigger issues. As you know, the book this year is Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist. And I just wanted to briefly tell you about the book if you haven't read it, as I know some of you may not have. The Writer's Witness program at AU, basically we have a summer book that all the incoming first year students read. It gives these students a common experience and provides them a model of the kinds of writing and moves that we want students students to practice in their whole academic career, but also in our writing studies classes. The books are always nonfiction, and they're grounded in argument and research and always related to current issues. So the book this year, again, if you haven't read it, is about Derek Black, who is the godson of David Duke and the son of Don Black, who's the founder of Stormfront, which I think still is the largest, but is the largest and oldest white nationalist website. This site has a dating page. It's been translated into 5 or 6 languages. So it's a big deal. So Derek is the son of Don Black, who started that website and sort of grew up in this very white nationalist world. The book is a story of his transformation. He goes to college. He goes to New College in Florida, and really basically has a total paradigm shift, changes his mind, and has now become really sort of an advocate of anti-racist ideas. So that's the basic premise of the book, again, if you haven't read it yet. So I will stop sharing my screen. I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia and then Sarah, and then I'll speak a little bit at the end. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Yeah, hopefully you can all see that. Great. So as Maya said, my name is Cynthia Miller-Idris. I'm a faculty member here, professor of education and sociology, but most of my time these days I spend in the Center for University Excellence, which is a new center about a year old that Scott Bass, former Provost Scott Bass, started. I run a lab there full-time, which is called the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, which is externally funded by a number of grants that are trying to test sort of design out-of-the-box intervention ideas to prevent radicalization to violent extremism and then produce empirical evidence on those. So I spend a fair amount of time talking to the media, writing op-eds, testifying and briefing policymakers, Congress, whatever, and lawmakers. And so there's a handful of questions I always get. And I thought that maybe it would be a good way to just sort of structure these remarks to talk about what those questions are, because if you're teaching this book, I can almost guarantee that you're gonna get them too. These are just questions that come up again and again and again anytime that we're talking about white supremacist extremism. And there are others. So one is, why do I call it white supremacist extremism? Eli Saslow calls it white nationalism, which is a term I don't like. And I'm happy to talk about that too, and the way in which I think this book frames even Derek Black's attempt to sanitize white supremacist extremism by calling it white nationalism toward the end, and then eventually moving away from that. But for now, I'll start with the other 5 questions and happy to come back to those at the end. My goal here is to just talk for 7 or 8 minutes. I think we're going to try to keep this pretty quick and then have lots of time for questions. So the first question that people may ask, and of course you have to document this first with the fact that it is rising, which it is on every measure we have available. So that data is out there pretty readily and can be pretty easily documented, that both on sort of plots foiled by the FBI, white supremacist extremist propaganda, hate crimes, terrorist attacks, the numbers of deaths, numbers of hate groups, on every measure we have available, essentially, far right and white supremacist extremism is rising and has been rising. The question sort of is why that's the case, and there are a number of different things that factor into that. I teach a whole class just on that issue, and so on the intersection of extremism and education and terrorism and why it is that these things are, we spend a lot of time talking about why, so it's hard to go over that in just a minute, but I would say there's a lot of propaganda out there, a lot of rhetoric out there, a lot of these narratives out there positioning sort of an us versus them world, offering conspiracy theories and scapegoats for problems that people perceive others to be able, that they can blame others for those plights. And so in a moment of confusion and uncertainty, isolation, where people have perceived grievances, there's a kind of perfect storm in which they become more susceptible to extremist rhetoric. So I'm happy to talk about that later, but I would say particularly during COVID-19, at this moment, we're at a moment of heightened vulnerability to extremist rhetoric across the ideological spectrum, but particularly on the far right. This is the whataboutism question, which I get all the time from like neighbors, relatives, and journalists and students, which is why are you talking about right-wing extremism? Why not talk about left-wing extremism? What about Antifa? We all know about how Antifa is being positioned and the anti-fascist extremism is being positioned in the media and by politicians, which I'm happy to talk about. But usually I think that's pretty easy to address with facts and statistics, particularly related to violence. And so I usually like to share statistics that come from something like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a centrist, nonpartisan think tank, which just last month released its analysis of 900 politically motivated plots and attacks in the US since 1994. This is what the figures look like. If you take out 9/11 and you take out Oklahoma City, which is what the 2010 figures do here, you'll see that Islamist attacks and far-right violence are not that different, 95 to 117. But in any case, when we're talking about victims of left-wing extremism, particularly of anti-fascist extremism, it's much, much less. There are violent attacks from the far left, but typically on property. And so again, I'm happy to talk about that and not condoning far-right or far-left violence, but just indicating where the threat, where the lethality lies right now. People usually ask about the role of misogyny, male supremacy, masculinity, toxic masculinity in extremism. And I just, this image is just from a book I read over the summer that I really like, that I recommend, about the increasing role of women in far-right extremism and white supremacist extremism. It is definitely increasing. Women are increasing on the softer side, we call it, which is sort of recruitment through YouTube videos, but also on the political side in Europe and far-right parties where you have many more women leaders, and even in terrorist cells, we have more women engaged in violence, but they are still the far minority. Men are responsible for almost all of the violence, and there's a lot to be said about the role of misogyny and male supremacy and its intersections with things like through the incel movements and ideologies which are involuntary celibates who believe they are entitled to sex with women and that they are being denied that, and often advocate rape and other kinds of forms of control over women. So those movements, which have been also responsible for terrorist violence, are part of the far-right spectrum, do intersect with some of the white supremacist movement, and I think has to be acknowledged and probably will come up in classes. Often, and you probably will, especially this fall, get questions about Trump. People want to know what impact the 2016 election had and what impact the 2020 election will have on these issues. And I think, it's important to note that there definitely has been a legitimation and a normalization and a mainstreaming of hate, of anti-immigrant sentiments, of valorization of violence, and some reinforcement of conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories like George Soros and the migrant caravan, in ways that matter, right? So I usually just say words matter. I mean, I think we've seen the ways that words matter across local elections, state elections, national elections in the US and globally. But also important to note that the rise in hate groups, and it precedes that 2016 election, that a lot of the rise in hate groups is documented back to 2008, 2009 in the wake of Barack Obama's election and a lot of mobilization around that. So these are longer term issues and trends, not just only tied to one election, not only tied to national politics, but also very much rooted in other kinds of local issues. And finally, I'll just close with, it can be really depressing to talk about these issues, I think, especially with students, and really focusing on, I like to always focus on what can be done. My lab released at the end of June a guide for parents and caregivers about how to build resilience and confront risk in the COVID-19 era, now that we have 70 million teenagers and young people at home all the time in an unprecedented moment of online engagement, combined with kind of distracted parents and caregivers and more isolation in ways that kind of create a perfect storm for extremist radicalization. And this is the first component in a broader toolkit. So there will be versions of this over the next, hopefully, year, maybe 6 months, for teachers, for faculty, for mental health counselors, for coaches. It's free, it's downloadable. It goes through things that might be useful for you to look out for in classrooms, like warning signs, particularly around COVID-19 and the way that extremist rhetoric and conspiracy theories show up online and are being used in these kinds of narratives about where COVID comes from, what a vaccine is going to do. It has a lot of suggestions for things like media literacy and things, ways to address and inoculate young people kind of against manipulation online, misinformation, and conspiracy theories. And this is just to show you, not to read this right now, but this section of the guide called How to Get Help, which is sort of down on the right over here, it's 3 pages with a lot of links, hyperlinks that can help you as a parent, as a faculty member, as a teacher, get a sense of where else to go for other types of resources around radicalization, around, there's teachers' guides, there's different guides for talking to kids about anti-racism, there's stuff on internet and technology addiction and online safety that might be useful to you in these contexts. This is just a list of that resource where you can find it. It should be up by now at our own website, which is american.edu/peril, but I know it's already downloadable at SPLC's website /peril. The second one is a link to that domestic terrorism analysis with the figures on left and white extremism. And the third is a completely shameless plug for my book, which will be out in October, called Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Right, which talks about a lot of these issues and might be useful, and which I hope you read. So I will stop there and happy to move into discussion and conversation whenever it would be useful.
So thank you, Cynthia. That's so fascinating, and I think speaks to quite a bit of why I find this book so interesting as a reader. I saw Eli Saslow speak many years ago at a narrative writing conference, and I was so engaged by his exploration into this world that for a long time has been hidden, right? Like the white supremacy movement was cloaked for a very long time. And so the fact that he was able to penetrate as they're rising into really public awareness and visibility, I think is really important. When I teach this book though, and I've taught this book once before, and like the rest of the writing studies program, we'll be teaching it again. I actually look at it as a parable for like college, right? Like, why is it important to go to college? Why is it important to think about how we use sources and how we engage in conversations about things? And when I look at how I'm going to teach this book, I'm really looking at how I'm going to use it really like as a parable for information literacy and source use and how to engage in academic dialogue. So I'm just going to talk a couple minutes about that. Give me a second while I share my screen. So one of the most important things that I think that we do as writing studies professors is help our students move as readers beyond emotionally reacting to things and into critical reading. There are certain things that I think characterize first-year students as thinkers and as readers. And as anyone who's worked with 18-year-olds know, like when they read a book, they either like it or they hate it. And it's mostly character driven, and it's mostly based and centered on their experiences, their own personal experiences. It reminds me of me in this way, so I like it. Or I can't relate to it, it's not relatable, so I don't want to read it, like that kind of thing. So I feel like if I think of my job as a writing studies professor in helping students move from how they read and write in high school and how they're supposed to read and write in college, I really want them to be critical readers. And I very frequently at the beginning of my 100 classes teach this triangle. This is W. Royce Adams is a reading scholar, and he has this very simple triangle where it shows affective reading, literal reading, and critical reading. And affective reading, I mean, as you can see, there are several components of it, but it's very reactionary, and it takes the least amount of cognitive effort, right? So as you see there, the feelings or emotions are on this. And one of the things I noticed when I read Rising Out of Hatred is how steeped in fear so much of Derek's thinking is. Like Derek is worried about the extinction of his race, right? And so that drives like everything he does, and he fits everything into a framework of what he's afraid of. Allison, on the other hand, is a real critical thinker, right? She reads critically, she thinks critically, she argues critically. And so one of the ways that I'll be using this book is talking about the shift that Derek made between being so emotionally reactive and being more of a critical reader. Another thing that I'll be talking about is critical thinking in general. There's a model that I use from two researchers named Elder and Paul from the Society for Critical Thinking, and they really emphasize the characteristics that critical thinkers all have. And two things that critical thinkers don't do, or that I should say they do, is they move past egocentric and sociocentric thinking. So, and that's another thing, that's what the students at New College in Florida, that's what they help Derek do. Like, they help him move beyond this little tiny world where he's homeschooled with this small group of people who think a certain way and who respond out of these fears, to be able to question material, to be able to ask questions and think about things, and think about the experiences and people in societies other than his own. So those are two of the characteristics that characterize all critical thinkers. And that's certainly what we want for our students to do in college. Another way that I help my students look at the tasks that we want them to do, no matter what our writer's witness book is, but we'll certainly be using this book, has to do with information literacy, right? Information literacy broadly is the way that we engage with sources, the way that we find them, the way that we read them, the way that we process them. And what I can't help but notice as I look at Derek and Allison, is that Derek's sources, I mean, they're both sort of equally intellectual if you think about it. They're both very engaged thinkers and readers and explorers, but Derek's sources are no good. Derek's sources, I looked up the sources that he speaks about being influenced by, and they're all from or have evolved out of the era in which racist pseudoscience was considered science. Whereas Allison's sources come from scholarly peer-reviewed things, which have a certain academic rigor, and they follow a scientific process. And so that's obvious to me as a professor as I'm reading, but I'll be using the text to sort of demonstrate that to my students. Like, a lot of the people who wrote the books that Derek used, they have PhDs or they're doctors of something or whatever, but if they're not using the scientific process, if they're writing from old, discredited, the biased IQ tests or measuring craniums or something like that, then they're not as credible as other sources. So I think that Allison really helps Derek learn how to evaluate what types of sources that he was using, even as she was helping him move on to different ways of thinking. Speaking of that, though, I don't like the idea, and I expect this will come up in class, I don't like the idea of seeing that group of students as models for how we should like rescue like dangerously demented humans. You know, like I think there's because that's something that those students did. I think that there's a risk of sending the message that like, well, we should rescue these, you know, if we find somebody, we can change the way they think. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. I think this is a very unique situation. But I think that the students who were able to help Derek move beyond his way of thinking, they followed, maybe instinctively, the rules of civil discourse. You know, so civil discourse is something that we as professors strive to help our students practice in our classrooms, right? Like how we can engage in a hearty, lively dialogue across ideologies without insulting each other, right? How do we create emotionally safe spaces in the classroom without being afraid to talk about certain things? In every syllabus that I have, no matter what class I'm teaching, I embed the CTRL's civil discourse guidelines because they're the best ones that I've seen. And when I read Rising Out of Hatred, I noticed, man, these students really did what we professors do when we're doing it well. So those are 4 of the things I do. And last thing that I'll probably do as I read is emphasize empathy as a writing skill. It's easy to read Rising Out of Hatred and see empathy all over it, right? I'm especially drawn to the character Moshe, I think his name is. I was saying Mosh as I read, but I heard the audiobook says Moshe. I'm fascinated by how he was able to listen to whatever it is inside of himself that told him that Derek was a real person, and that by being decent, he could facilitate change. I think it's fascinating. But as I said, like, I don't like the idea of using this book to encourage students necessarily to do that. But empathy is also a writing skill. The writing scholars Green and Ladinsky have a section in one of their books where they talk about really good writers are receptive to the ideas of others. It's easy as a writer, and certainly in first-year students, we see it all the time, where you go into a source, you find the part that you agree about, and you drop it in your paper, right? But good writers have to hear other perspectives, and that requires a certain type of empathy. And so you have to engage with the ideas of others. You have to engage respectfully, and you have to be honest about how you engage the ideas of others, and possibly even be flexible in your thinking and willing to change. And I think ultimately that's what Derek did through these students who were just uniquely able to bring all of what we try to bring as writing studies professors, in my opinion. So that's all I wanted to say. That's how I'll be using the book.
Lovely. Thank you, Cynthia and Sarah. So just to round out this panel, I'm going to talk very briefly a little bit about language and rhetoric, which is one of the things that most drew the committee to this book. So let me just pull up my thing here. Okay. Okay, so one of the things that I've thought a lot about after reading, I've read this book a couple times now, is the way in which language and rhetoric works, right? It's no surprise to any of us, right, that language can shape and mold our worldview, right? We can hide things, we can highlight things, we can dissemble and prevaricate. We can do all of these things with language, right? We can really alter the way things are perceived. And I think this works on sort of 2 basic levels in the book, probably more, but 2 ways I've been thinking about it is, first off, the way that Derek uses his language within the white nationalist movement, and then also the way Saslow uses language. And so those are 2 things I just wanted to talk about briefly. So Derek, as I mentioned, and again, if you've read the book, Derek was really tasked with cleaning up, I think Cynthia spoke to this, cleaning up the language within white white nationalism, which of course Cynthia said as well, right, is also problematic. The way this name has shifted, right? But Derek's mission within Stormfront was to really polish it, to sanitize it. It was a very intentional choice, right? He wanted to avoid things like racial slurs and all that sort of nasty, dirty language, right? He wanted to polish the look of white nationalism. And so he very purposely chose the way he framed things, both within his personal interactions, but also what he put up on Stormfront, right? He pushed this idea of white genocide, right? This idea that white people were being, sort of systematically taken out, right? He really pushed this idea. He also says things like he calls white nationalists racial realists, racial idealists, right? Again, all of this sort of softer language around really these sort of atrocious ideas. And a lot of this was, again, really purposeful. And this rebranding makes the movement really palatable, right? So that you can reach more people, right? By taking out all these racial slurs and taking out all that sort of old language, right? He was manipulating, right? And asking people to think about white nationalism differently. One example of this, which isn't Derek doing it, but I think a really good example of it is the way in which the white nationalist name has changed, right? So over the years, as you probably know, we've gone from, the KKK. This is not a definitive list, of course, but we've gone from the KKK to white power, to white pride, to white supremacy, to white nationalism, and probably many of us would argue the alt-right, right? And these movements, right? It's a similar, same movement with a different name, right? And the shifting language takes us from that sort of, racist bigot to a Richard Spencer sort of type, right? A sort of more legit looking political movement. And really just by changing that name, it's really shifting the way we think about these things. And one of the things, that last little point on the slide I have up, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, Don Black, Derek's dad, talks about in the book is he said he likes to target people that say, I'm not a racist, but, right? These people that don't want to think of themselves as bigots. They don't want to think of themselves as racist. And those are the very people that Don Black himself wanted to proselytize to, wanted to bring into the fold of the movement. So that's sort of Derek's language and rhetoric. That was one piece of what I have been thinking about with this book. The other one is Saslow's language himself, right? Because if you've read the book, it's really a narrative. It's really a story. You don't see Saslow in there, which is really interesting, especially for 18, 19-year-old students coming into our courses. They tend to think, well, this is just neutral, right? This is objective, right? This is just the story. We of course know that's not true, right? Saslow's in there. He's making choices, right? He's deciding to do certain things. And so I think it's really interesting to think about the authorship in there as well. Even though he's not visible in the text, those moves, right? Those things that he chooses to do in the book, are of course purposeful. Right. So some of the questions, I put some of the questions up here, rhetorical questions that we often ask our students to think about in our classes. So we ask them to think about audience, right? And you can think about this with Saslow, right? Who's his audience, right? Who is he speaking to and how do we know this? Purpose, right? What's he trying to do? And then these emotional appeals, because of course, if you've read the book, you'll see that it is a sympathetic picture of Derek Black, right? Who is aligned with all of these terrible ideas. And yet you read the book and you feel that love story and you feel for him. Even while sort of holding, on the other hand, the knowledge that he's has these terrible ideologies, if you will. So those are just some interesting things I've been thinking about with language and rhetoric around this book. I also wanted to share with you a couple weeks ago on August 4th, and this is my last little point here, I wanted to share with you, I did a webinar with the incoming first year students on this book and on the choice of this book. And these are just some questions that the students were asking, which I thought were really interesting questions. So I just wanted to share these because these are things that our students are going to be thinking about. There were were a number of questions on how Saslow downplayed white nationalist atrocities. The students wanted to know why. Was it too much? Was that sort of whitewashing the whole, for lack of a better term, was that sort of whitewashing the whole issue? They also were curious about this love story because, of course, if you've read the book, you know it is a love story. And they thought maybe it focused too much on that and left out some of the more important details of Derek Black and his background. They also asked about science, right? Why don't people believe in science? Which, good question, right? And then they asked about why other students would put up with Derek's beliefs, right? So these very liberal new college students, why did they put up with this? Why did they listen to Derek, right? Why did they sit there knowing all of the things that Derek and his family had propagated? That's the wrong word, but so I just wanted to share those questions from students again, just to sort of give a little view into what the students are thinking of. So that is it for me. I just wanted to, I'll stop sharing here and then we can open it up to questions and discussion. So I think there's few enough that we can just raise hands or use the chat box. So yeah. Anybody has questions or things they want to talk about?
Maya, I have a thought, thinking about the webinar and all that, and all the relevant stuff that you all brought up that's so rich in this book. I mean, I think one of the challenges of working with this material, and Cynthia, you might have encountered this too, is students are very compelled, I think, by the drama of the issues and the emotions of the issues and all. And I'm thinking about the challenge of managing discussion so that we're still, we're kind of covering the material that we want to cover while giving students space to kind of engage with these very difficult, very fraught topics on their terms. Their kind of need to work through it and think through it and engage with it in an affective way, in that, in that more personal, emotional way. And yet also making sure that, we're talking about the rhetoric and we're talking about information literacy, or we're talking about the politics, and the policy organizations. And so I'm wondering about your thoughts about that kind of, that kind of management that extends beyond this book. I think it extends to any time we're talking about fraught, difficult, emotionally charged topics that some of our students might have been targets of too. How do we balance that respect and their need for space and a type of engagement with the need to cover content and the need to help them engage with the content that we know our course needs to be covering?
Well, one thing that occurred with me is, as you said, right, we always find this, right, in writing studies specifically, where students really want to talk about content and not so much the writing moves. But with this content, because as you say, Lacey, it's so difficult, it occurred to me, and I don't know, Sarah, maybe you have experience having taught this book before, but that this would be the kind of book that we would really need to lay some groundwork for first, like you talked about civil discourse, right, and having that all outlined. I think that's really important for this book, and maybe even more important now that we're online, right, that we don't have faces and those personal interactions. And so for me, I think some of that groundwork in the beginning is going to be really important. So that's addressing part of your question. Yeah, I don't know, Sarah, did you do anything specifically around this when you taught this? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I have like a whole pedagogy around,
I'm sure you do.
dealing with racially inflammatory material. But one of the things that I do, like you said, is I lay the groundwork with civil discourse. But that little model from critical thinking really helps. I also present that early on. So it's a little graph and it talks about different aspects of critical thinking. Because sociocentric thinking is on there and egocentric thinking is on there, when I find students who are engaging in ideas that, you know, in casual conversation I would call racist. They show up in papers a lot. And so when I've already established that that vocabulary, I can ask a student to consider the sociocentricity of their thinking. You see how that's different than like you're being a racist, like that's racist. Like, because really like the tension in classrooms around racially fraught subjects, a lot of it has to do with, as Lacey said, what people have already experienced. A lot of it has to do with people's fear and defensiveness about being labeled. And so I try to have things that I can point to about a paper and about you know, rhetorical things or critical thinking things that I can point to instead of the student. I don't know if that makes sense. But in terms of Lacey's question about, the way I see it is like letting them move through that space, like because I am the way I am, like I think, okay, you guys have like 3 or 4 classes that you can and you have this one project that I'm going to let you just like emote, like maybe it's a personal reflection or maybe it's a thing, but I take it in stages to move them past it. Like I know that they're going to be emotional about the books that they read, and this one probably even more so. So I let it happen and then I put the kibosh on it.
I would just add, I haven't taught this book, but when I teach my course on extremism and terrorism, which does have a lot of inflammatory material in it, and one thing I found really helpful is to do, and I don't know how it would work online. I'll find out in the spring when I teach it again. But kind of what I call emotional deep dives for the first 5 minutes of class, which the class is broken up into kind of thematic areas that are vulnerabilities or create susceptibilities to extremist movements. So things like conformity, sense of conformity, or traditional gender norms around masculinity and femininity, and whether you'd be susceptible to, you know, promises of brotherhood and belonging and that kind of stuff. And by taking them, it requires a lot of trust building, a lot of work at the beginning of the class for it to be kind of a very safe environment for everyone. But there've been some really amazing moments. I'll never forget one where we were doing a quick conformity quiz, and you know, this often comes up in discussions about the Holocaust, when everyone in surveys, like almost everybody who's a high school student in Germany, will say, you know, that their great grandparents were resistors. Like far disproportionate number of people think that their great grandparents were resistors than ever could have possibly been the case, right? And so, you know, this idea that you would have been a resistor instead of conforming to the law, or, you know, or following a totalitarian regime, for example, you know, is the idea behind sort of checking out your own vulnerabilities. Like, do you follow all the rules, even if you think those rules might need to be broken? And, you know, what are the complicating factors around that? And so we were doing this conformity quiz, and finally, you know, at the end of it, we're talking through your responses. How much do you really feel you need to conform? And one young woman raises her hand and said, I admit it, I'm a complete conformist. Like, I know that I would have followed the rules in Nazi Germany, even though it shames me to say so. And she said, I'm such a conformist that while I was filling out the quiz, I looked to my right and my left to see what my peers were doing and changed my responses, right? To like so that I was more in line with what they were saying. It was this really raw, vulnerable moment for her that kind of made everybody else feel more open about this. Like, I don't know if I'd be a resistor, or I don't know if I'm as much of a rebel as I'd like to believe that I am. And do I stand up enough? Do I, you know, and I think, anyway, so if you can create the right environment, I feel like those sorts of spaces, those kinds of personal reflections, if kept in check for a few minutes at the beginning of class, these were like bounded 8 minutes max, and then we would move into the discussion, really kind of set up the relationship building across the students and allowed us to dive into the material without so much kind of judgment. There's a little more empathy, I guess, in Sarah's words too, and less judgment for just like assuming that they think they know how they would react if they're born into a family like Derek Black's family, with homeschooled, with no other ideological, you know, information available to them. I think it's easier to judge than it is to kind of understand that. The remarkable thing in many ways is that he got out of it, in my view. But what does it mean to grow up in that environment, and how could you ever be anything else at that moment, and how did he come out? So anyway, that's a ramble, but I think I think connecting to some of the things that might force them to be a little uncomfortable. If you can create that space online, which I think is a big if. And that would be a pedagogical question really for folks who've done that more than I have. But I think that I have found really helps people talk about issues that where they might want to position themselves automatically one way or the other and be a little bit less empathetic.
Can I ask a question to Sarah or anybody else who may choose to respond?
Sure.
Yeah. So you were talking about how Derek thinks that he's dispassionate and logical, but he's pointing to these sources that are flawed and racist, coming from an era of pseudoscience, while Allison's are scholarly and peer-reviewed and everything. When I was reading this earlier this summer, I was simultaneously reading Stamped from the Beginning. So it was in my mind how so often throughout history, those that were considered the apex of credibility and the greatest thinkers of their time were absolutely promoting pseudoscience and racist ideas. So my question is, what tips or practices might you suggest for coaching the students in terms of a critical evaluation of the credibility of their sources? And how do you confront a past in which, you know, what was respected at the time as science is really a pseudoscience? How can you kind of make the students believe that there is such a thing as scientific credibility among those sources that we think are stronger?
Yeah, I was really impressed by the questions that I guess Maya posted, like that why don't people believe in science was one of them. I love the fact that students ask that. It blows my mind that we even have to be talking about that in 2020. But you know, one of the Association for College and Research Librarians frames has to do with understanding authority, right? So that's the body that the Association for Research Librarians, and it's who we look to for our standards on information literacy. And one of the big ones is that you know, people with good information literacy skills understand that texts are authored, and you have to do research on who those people are. Like you have to look at who they are, and you have to look at who they are reading, who they're citing, and whether they're citing, because a lot of the racist pseudoscience doesn't cite at all. And so then it becomes about this process of assessing your own material and looking for flags that say, well, this source should raise question, even though this person has doctor in front of their names, right? I noticed that they're citing Mendelow's work, right, or whatever, or they're, you know, so I mean, to me, it has to do about a process. I mean, the fact is that our students nowadays have to do a lot more to figure out what's credible, I think, than we did when I was in college. When I was in college, we trusted certain publishers, and we knew that this was a scholarly publication because it came from a certain publisher, and that was it. There was no internet, you know, so it was far easier. But I think that they have steps to do to figure it out. And I think that understanding the processes of science, like what is it that's when scientists are gathering data, like the actual scientific process is not so different than what we teach in information literacy, right? It's like, how are you using data? How are you looking at it? How are you controlling for certain things? I think, like, I'm really toying around, Mary, with the idea of teaching the scientific process just for like a part of a class. You know, Kimberly and Angela and I are about to read some racist pseudoscience. We're looking at Nell Irvin Painter's book on the history of white people, is what she calls it, but it's about racist pseudoscience. And we all bought Our Nordic Race. Yeah, yikes, you have it. And so what we're going to be doing, Mary, is looking at the logical flaws that they engage in, because they speak with such authority, right? Those racists of yore, and these two. But I can see why Derek could not question it. But if you study logical flaws, right, like those actual classic logic and logic flaws, you'll see it everywhere in their work, right? And you hear it everywhere in so-called alt-right rhetoric today. So I think to answer your question, like, I'm taking it a notch back to processes. I'm looking really at teaching logical flaws so that we can look at Our Nordic Race, and we can look at something from, you know, a psychologist today, and we can see the difference in terms of the process and the authority and their source use. Do you guys, yeah.
Can I just really quick piggyback on that to say I absolutely agree with everything Sarah said. I think the issue of source integrity and, you know, media literacy in general, and separating kind of also in the news, the fake news, where we're going to end up with deep fake videos, we're facing a big struggle for young people. But I would also add, I think one of the things to be aware of in the very modern white supremacist extremist movements is that they have increasingly started adopting what I would consider to be really mainstream, totally legitimate scientific sources. So it's not just that they're promoting pseudoscience and race science, but they're also taking things like data on demographic change and immigration, or Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, which was featured on a white supremacist website for a while here in the US, or data on climate change. You know, climate change and environmental concerns were cited in the El Paso and the Christchurch manifestos for those terrorists, and taking them and twisting them, right? So using legitimate data and science and twisting it through a frame of threat and the need to protect white civilizations as a result of, or white people as a result of demographic change and immigration, or climate change, and so we need to protect this space for white people and close borders, or whatever it is. And so I think that that's almost like a different beast, because it's an additional burden for faculty and instructors and teachers and parents also to be aware of, that even if we teach kids, students about source integrity and facts and legitimacy of research, there's still a framing that's happening, and sometimes in increasing ways, that makes it more difficult, I think, to understand how the manipulation is happening. So it's recognizing the twisting through an ideological frame of threat that is also really important to be aware of. So.
And I think too, like, you know, it's why I'm going back into some of the things that I studied in college about these logical flaws, because I remember one thing I learned in undergraduate school, the whole correlation does not equal causation logical flaw. Like when I hear these, like I had Lacey knows, I had a student this semester who was really toying around with some of these racist ideas, and he was looking at census data about differences between different demographics. And so because certain people were associated with certain problems, it was that they were causing the problem, right? That's a really basic logical flaw, you know, in terms of thinking. And I also saw that Olivia, did you have your hand up? You wanted to say something about information literacy, probably?
Just a tiny bit. So yeah, I did drop a link to the framework that Sarah was referencing, just so that, you know, you have easy access to it. But I also just wanted to share in terms of my own thinking about how to teach information literacy in a sort of social media, web saturated environment, that some of our older tools don't really hold up. Right? If you think about a tool like the CRAP tool, where we think about the currency and the relevancy, and like, does the web page have ads all over it? And to Cynthia's point, like, people have gotten really savvy about producing documents that would pass some of our old tests, but are not quality documents. And so one of the librarians that I've sort of been following on this issue is named Mike Caulfield. And he has put together, through some research with professional fact checkers, a method that he calls SIFT. And it's stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace the claims. And it works really well with web stuff. And I'll put a link to some of his materials too. But that stop piece is really important because he really emphasizes this idea that if your reaction is at all emotional, right? If you're like, I have to share this because it's terrible, because it's wonderful, because it reflects my beliefs, because it offends my beliefs, right? If you have an emotional reaction to information you're ingesting, the first thing to do is stop and walk away from that source, actually, and then find other sources that might have already looked into it, who might have sort of wrestled with that. And one of the things he says is like, the truth is in the network, right? That we don't necessarily evaluate a source on its own terms, we evaluate a source in a network of information. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about information literacy that is in some ways a departure from our old way of thinking about it, right? We used to have a checklist that you'd run down, this source passes this checklist. And this is really sort of encouraging us to teach information literacy as part of a network of information and putting a source in a broader context and to sort of having some tools for doing that. So I'll shut up now, drop that link into the comments field. And
I wanted to ask a question about, I think all of us have probably had the experience of students who take new terms or ideas and try them out in another class, often clumsily. And so thinking about other first-year classes, what do you think might be some of those clumsy terms or ideas that students might take from your discussion of this book into their classrooms that they should anticipate?
I'm not really sure. Maya, what do you think? What might they take from our classes, Bradley, clumsily into the world beyond us? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think about that. Bradley, did you mean like from the book or from things we were teaching or both or?
Yeah, both, I guess, especially, but specifically to the book, like as they're engaging with that text and the ways that you're engaging them with that text, and then all moving into their AUX class or to their complex problems class. Because this is a kind of shared experience, I think it bubbles up in a more stark sort of way than it may otherwise. And so I expect that those conversations will sort of continue on. And so I'm curious what those conversations you expect they'll still be wanting to raise in other contexts.
Yeah. Well, one thing I just thought of as you were speaking was when Sarah was talking about this model of empathy, right? And that maybe Derek's story isn't the story for everyone, trying to convert someone or trying to change someone's ideas. I mean, this is, as Sarah said, very unique story, right? And a very unique character. And so I wonder if, and I'm thinking of this like down race lines as well, right? If there's something that will come up about just being empathetic or just listening or just understanding, and where that line is. Because it's tricky, right? And it's really tricky right now. And so that's something I can maybe see. And I don't know if that makes sense exactly, but you know, just that idea that we just need to be patient and listen and understanding. And again, that's a balance, right? And that's a fine line to have to walk. And as Sarah said, I don't think that necessarily always works, right? So.
Yeah, I think there's a part, that's what I was going to say as you were talking, Bradley. I was thinking that the thing that I am most uncomfortable with about this book is that it's just so rare that this could actually happen. And a lot of it had to do with who Derek is.
Yeah.
Really, like Derek, I mean, how many white nationalists would go to a Seder? Like, there was something about him that predisposed him to being willing to listen. But I think that because of the developmental age of our students, like they'll be able to relate to Allison, like arguing with all this evidence and making these impassioned pleas and forwarding these sources for him to read. And that like people caught in those situations who are like Derek are probably 1 in a million. You know, I mean, there was a lot about him that was already primed, I think, to be open to listening.
Yeah, it's actually interesting in that webinar that Lacey and I did a couple of weeks ago. One of the questions, or one of the things they were talking about was just even New College. Like, why the heck did he go there, right? I mean, this bastion of like liberal thinking. That's a move that you can't imagine many people in the white nationalist movement, white supremacist movement, making, right? I mean, so even that is a really strange choice with all the schools in Florida. He goes to this, you know, crazy liberal left school, you know. So yeah.
And I'd be curious, there are quite a few writing studies colleagues on here. I'd be curious to know what they think. Like, what are the things that they anticipate as being problematic in teaching this? What do you think, Kelly?
I don't know if I have an answer to that. What I'm thinking of, this goes back to what Cynthia was saying earlier about conforming. And I feel like to a certain extent, Derek was conforming. He also claims to be non-confrontational, which is really interesting. That's not something we think about when we think about this sort of extreme, these sort of extreme views. But he considers himself a non-conformist, non-confrontational. He doesn't really want to argue with people. He wants to be in a pocket where, you know, people are nodding at him and he's comfortable. And so I think there's a great opportunity for us to talk in our classes about, you know, the ties that bind and how comfortable we all are in our various bubbles, and how difficult it is to change our minds. And it occurs to me that Derek Black, his transformation is almost brought about because he just decides all of this stuff has accrued in my head. I've been persuaded. I mean, if I sort of get out of my own way, I've been persuaded over and over and over again. But I just sort of denied it. Now I guess I'm going to walk through this beautiful city in Serbia or wherever he was, and I'm just going to decide to change my mind and transform myself. So it's like an act of will. So I sort of look forward to the opportunity to talk in the classes about, you know, what's holding you back from changing your mind about something. And as we get closer to the election, we can talk about, you know, what's really making you want to vote the way that you vote, either, you know, right or left. And is it because you've really thought about the issues and you have these beliefs, or is it because your parents have sort of influenced your voting in certain ways? Or, you know, what exactly is the power that your particular demographic has over you? Seems like that's a good discussion to have too.
Yeah. Cynthia, I'm curious, do you know how often, I mean, this sort of transformation happens? I don't know if this is, I mean, I would imagine not super common. I'm just curious.
I was going to say, you know, so what we would call what happened to Derek de-radicalization. And de-radicalization is extremely difficult. It's very hard to bring about intentionally. It does happen. I mean, there are, you know, hundreds of people who've been de-radicalized. There are several different organizations run here in the US and overseas, Hope Not Hate, Life After Hate, groups that are run by formers that work to de-radicalize, that take, you know, and field calls, we field calls from parents, from principals, from, you know, all the time of, you know, people seeking help, either trying to de-radicalize or to get information about how you can get somebody out of a movement or a scene, or because they have fears about what's happening. What I will say is that I think the point that was just made about the will to come out, I mean, that's consistent with what we know from research, is that it takes It takes a very long time. It takes years to come out, and most people don't come out until they're ready to come out. In other words, it's very hard to bring that about intentionally. And that gets to that question of like kind of the savior complex that students might get out of this. But what does work to bring them out usually is years of extended long-term engagement with people who are different from them, who make them confront the contradictions in their life and in their beliefs. So I did interviews with formers in Germany for one of my books, and you know, one of the things they said was their brother married somebody from Vietnam, or their teacher was from Bosnia, or they were sitting next to a kid from Turkey for a year in their classroom. And over the course of multiple conversations over long periods of time, they realized that the things they held in their head could not be true because they didn't match the experience they had with these people who cared about them and showed them love and empathy and respect. And so that is, you know, it's almost impossible to bring about, which is why like a lab like ours, we focus on prevention. We're trying the inoculation. We're trying to prevent people from entering on the pathway. You can build what we call off ramps at early stages. That's also successful, but very, very difficult to de-radicalize someone. So it has been done, but again, most of the time people don't come out till they're ready to come out. Then when they're ready to come out, what they need is mental health resources, support for kind of the ideological challenges that are resulting. Sometimes they've lost their entire networks. Often they leave their families behind, their entire, sometimes livelihood, friendships. It's like exiting gangs in some cases, where you just have to really get out and be separated and have resources and support to start an entirely new life. Derek had that because he had a relationship with someone who was offering him that kind of support. But you'll see, I think his story is typical in the sense of it taking years. It's atypical in the sense of he didn't have a prior, there wasn't a radicalization journey that he went on. He was radicalized from birth. And so there wasn't a prior, you know, comparison. It wasn't like getting into a cult and then getting out of a cult. It was, you know, the people who he loved in his life in every capacity were reinforcing those beliefs. And that part of it is extraordinary, I think, in terms of him being able to leave it, because it does seem that there was love from his family, which is one of the things I think that's really compelling in the book too, is like, it's not like it's abuse in a different way, but it's, you know, there was care and love coming from people in his surrounding, in his childhood and his early life. And so you could see why it would be hard for him to walk away from that into something that was disavowing his entire family too. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying it's rare, not as rare as you think, but very difficult to do it intentionally. So we have a former working full-time a former alt-writer working full-time in our lab. We have a couple people who consult for us, who are remarkable and really, really helpful at helping design interventions that reach people where they are. And so, but they all came out when they were ready to come out, not because somebody tried to pull them out. If that makes sense.
I actually have a question for you, Cynthia. How would you suggest that we teach this responsibly, writing studies in this way? Like how, you know, in talking to students, like just saying like, oh, well, this is rare, this rarely happens, like I feel like is not really going to stick compared to the emotional impact of the story, right? And I think that Allison is very similar to a lot of our students in a lot of ways. So how would you suggest, or do you have sources for us? Like just even the term de-radicalization, like I took note of that, like so that I could use that in my classroom, but how do you suggest that writing studies teaches this responsibly in that way?
I can send some resources. There are a couple of really good things that I've used in my classroom, including videos with formers. There's a group that has some curricular guides in the UK that might be useful. But I think, you know, I think that, I think there are ways in which the story is really similar to other kinds of stories about healing. You know, I used to live in Burundi and between Hutus and Tutsis, right, where you're looking at conflict resolution work and peace building work in parts of the world that have been beset by conflict in long periods of time, meaning that what has been successful in the programs that have done that well are building trust, often through the arts, through theater-based programs, through soccer programs that bring people together across differences over long periods of time, that get them to build trust and engage with each other. And then through those relationships, they're less likely to engage in violence, and sometimes the ideological divisions also break down. So, you know, that's through my experience in the world of sort of conflict resolution and peace building, I know a lot of those, and this is more similar to those stories, in fact, than to other stories in the world of extremism, if you will, because I feel like this is different than most stories of extremism. So I think focusing on the story itself, and I also think it's a story about the liberal arts and the power of the liberal arts and the power of critical thinking, the power of trust and of relationships in kind of challenging and transforming people's thinking, and getting them to think more critically in the way that those interviews that I've done with formers also did. You know, one of the formers I know, Arno, who runs Life After Hate, he talks about having come out basically through pure kindness. He was a, you know, visually obvious neo-Nazi who was the lead singer in a far-right extremist band, virulent, awful lyrics that inspired a lot of young people during the 1990s, including one who went on to kill 6 people at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin.
Is that Christian Picciolini that you're talking about?
No, Arno Michaelis, but Christian is another person who I know who has a similar story. But Arno's story is that he was working a job and he didn't have any money. He was completely broke. And this African-American colleague of his gave him like half his sandwich, like more than once, basically. He didn't have any lunch. And over time that evolved into a friendship, and that kindness, he talks about it as the impact of kindness, basically at changing his entire life view, like starting with one simple act of kindness, and then that evolved over years. Again, still it took him to come out. But I think, you know, kindness and empathy does go a long way, even though you want to be careful not to get into that kind of rescue complex. So sorry, that's long-winded, but I don't know if that answers any questions, but I will look up some resources.
Yeah, that was fascinating, and I'm going to look for those resources from you.
I can send them along too.
Thank you.
So much of what you have been saying strikes me as these transformative experiences are kind of affective responses to whatever is going on. And I do think that it was important in Saslow's narrative to follow the love story, because Derek was lonely. Derek was falling in love. Those were some of the gateways that, you know, impelled him to go to the Seder dinner. And thinking about the fact that our students are going to have effective responses to the reading, I want to be able to frame it in terms of their costs and benefits, or their uses and limits, explicitly in terms of, you know, purpose. What are we trying to accomplish? How far can we go with emotion? And when does logic kick in? When does information literacy, you know, point you down one path instead of another?
I like that way of framing it, Mary. It's helpful for me to hear people think of it that way.
Yeah, I would just say too that a lot of the major drivers toward extremism, and again, not just far-right extremism, but Islamist extremism, other forms of extremism, and cults, are around issues of belonging. You know, Christian Picciolini, who's a former white supremacist extremist, describes it as having found a family. You know, people who find a sense of belonging. There's explicit language marketed to them around brotherhood, around people having your back, you'll never walk alone, a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, to enact meaning in their life, restore something that maybe is at threat of being lost. So a lot of them feel that they're being kind of heroic in their engagement, and it's moral. It's a really moral and affective engagement for them, which is hard to wrap our heads around. But if you think you're saving your people, and you really believe that, and your whole ideology and framework is set up that way, that's the framing. And so, you know, whether you're restoring a caliphate or whether you're restoring an ethno-state, right? These people, they really do think that they're rescuing and saving and acting heroically. And you hear that kind of language in terrorist manifestos all the time. And so I think when we talk about the affective, I think the affective part of the trust and the friendship and the love and the fellowship even that he got from people was really important in challenging those contradictions, but also in kind of helping him understand that there was a pathway that was separate from his family.
I see Anna has her hand up. Do you want to?
Yes, thank you. I have a question. I'm going to be teaching my course for the first time, and it's on immigration, history, policy, but focusing on the impact on state and local government policies. This whole discussion has really kind of awakened me that I might have, I have no idea who my students will be. So I need to be sensitive from their views. But my point is, I'm not going to tell them how to think about immigration. I'm hoping they'll come to those conclusions, getting more facts. But I'm wondering how to handle more the personal opinion that people might have on immigration. I don't know if there's, we've been discussing a book and it's kind of out there. Now we're bringing it home. I want to walk the fine line of being able to just provide them with resources and facts. We're going to do an exercise on the census, for example. But can I go too far in trying to get them to see how racist and xenophobic U.S. immigration policies have been?
I think so. I think you can go too far. I think that especially in this political climate, I think that there have been eras in which professors could nudge people a little bit, you know, I mean, I don't know. I think what you're talking a lot about is developing a personal teaching style, but I think that is, you know, asking open-ended questions is really important. You know, getting students to think through or to raise their own questions or to see the value in questioning. You know, like I've started teaching questioning as a topic, like that as you're reading something, like, are you taking it to be fact or are you asking questions of it? Like, you know, critical reading involves engaging with, you know, and I'm thinking you're talking about data, you're talking about reading sources that provide data. Like, I mean, I think it's incredibly important that we be aware of not indoctrinating students. And I know that's not what you're talking about, but even I think there have been other days in academia that professors were a little bit freer to be who they are, while also allowing for students to have you know, their own opinions. But I think that teaching from a perspective of process and questioning is really important. Students will engage each other and challenge each other.
Yeah, I would agree totally with what Sarah says, with maybe one caveat, which is that I usually, when I make sure that if it's the topic that's relevant. So if I'm talking about extremism, right, I define extremism as ideologies and beliefs that position us versus them in a way that is outside of the boundaries of democracy. And so when you're talking about things that are anti-democratic, then I think you can point out, you know, or that are dehumanizing. I think it's possible to point out things that are dehumanizing and anti-democratic in terms of them being extreme or extremist sentiments without making that political, right? So there's an acceptable range of democratic ideas that are within a whole full range of democracy. And I think we probably, as faculty, need to make sure that those can be expressed by students and debated, and they can debate that. And I see my job as a faculty member to facilitate that discussion. But when we're talking about, you know, when we're starting to look at policies that are advocating for an ethno-state and deportation and what's in softened words like ethnic remigration, right? That's to me, outside of the bounds of liberal democracy and constitutional, kind of what we stand for in this country. And so I think that's pointing out what's extremist about that is, to me, not indoctrination. But I think there's a line there that has to be carefully weighed. That is, that to me, that's not political. That's trying to work against the system and promote something that is extremist. That's different than democratic practice.
It sounds to me like if I'm thinking in terms of pedagogy, then it sounds to me, Cynthia, like defining or having students define those things earlier, maybe early in the semester, probably is really important in topics like yours.
Yeah, we do a lot of definition. For example, like what's radicalism versus what's extremism. Well, typically radicalism is within the boundaries of democratic societies.
Okay.
And I find it troubling, but it's not illegal, right? But extremism is working against systems in ways that trying to bring them down, and often through the use of violence. And so I think some of those definitions are really important to kind of understand, and understand also that states define those things differently globally. So if you're talking globally about, so what one government's rebel movement, so one person's extremist movement gets defined by, a rebel movement gets defined as an extremist movement. So those are fluid definitions, and you have to be cautious about that too. Just labeling, a lot of things got labeled as extremist and have been labeled as extremist as a way of framing dissident and rebel movements as against existing governments. And so, but I think, yeah, definitions are important. And I'm sure the other issue that will come up is free speech, versus hate speech. And I think that's going to be an important one for people to figure out how to grapple with too. That comes up all the time around controversial speakers on campus or provocative speakers. So I don't know how much that'll come up, but certainly I think that it was in the backdrop for me of like the conversations that Ely Saslow was relating, or the discussions that the university seemed to be having, like students who were protesting and wanted Derek Black kicked out or sanctioned in some way. And then clearly there was a whole story there that Saslow didn't quite tell, but that was hinted at around the university's decisions around allowing Black to stay and to stay in classrooms. And I wish we had more of that story, but I think that was also kind of compelling to understand, so.
Thank you all. We're a little bit over our time, so we're going to wrap it up. But thank you, everyone, for all those interesting questions and bits of discussion. So good luck with the semester, and
good luck, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, everyone.